Greetings from the island of Oahu, where I am socially distancing. Our passage today comes from Exodus chapter 34 and is set within the larger narrative of the Torah, or the so-called Law, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Our passage is the culmination of the infamous golden calf incident, beginning in Exodus chapter 34. According to the narrative, God cuts a covenant with the people and reveals a multitude of commandments to Moses on top of Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. In biblical terms, a very, very long time. When the people saw that Moses was delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us, who shall go before us. As for this Moses, this man who brought us out from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So Aaron fashioned a golden calf, and they declared, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Moses descends from the mountain carrying the 2 tablets of the covenant and sees the Israelites celebrating around the golden calf, he threw the tablets from his hand and broke them at the foot of the mountain. In our passage today, God instructs Moses to, quote, "cut 2 tablets of stone like the former ones, and God will write on the tablets the words that were on the former tablets," end quote. Thus, this passage portrays God as renewing the covenant with the people, the covenant that the people had broken by worshiping the golden calf. The passage then narrates God's proclamation and revelation of who God is. Quote, "The Lord passed before Moses and proclaimed, 'The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation." End quote. One of the classes I regularly teach at Grinnell College is a course in which I introduce students to the history and literature of the books collected in the Hebrew Bible, the so-called Old Testament. I really don't like the term Old Testament and avoid it whenever I can. The term Old Testament reflects a particular Christian perspective that presupposes the New Testament and often relegates the books of the Old Testament to a second-class status. Moreover, there is a common stereotypical understanding of the Bible that the God of the so-called Old Testament is a God of wrath and judgment, while the God of the so-called New Testament is a God of love and forgiveness, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. This stereotypical understanding has its roots in Protestant, especially Lutheran and Reformed theologies that contrast the law with the gospel. But like all stereotypes, this understanding is very distorted. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin." In this dramatic scene, the God of the Hebrew Bible, the God of the so-called Old Testament, is revealing God's self to be merciful and gracious, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. This is the God of love and forgiveness. This is the God of the Torah. But of course, the passage doesn't end there. Again, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. Biblical forgiveness is not cheap grace. There are consequences to our actions. Over the past several years of teaching the Hebrew Bible course, I've increasingly come to have students pause and really contemplate this passage. For many of them, whether Christian or not, perhaps for many of us, including myself, raised in an ethos where forgiveness is equated with forgetting, this passage is difficult, reflecting a tension, a contradiction, or a paradox. Forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty. Despite forgiveness, there are consequences. Not only are there consequences to our actions, even when we are forgiven, but that sin is bigger than individual acts that we commit. The Israelites understood that sin and iniquity are social rather than merely individualistic, and their effects are societal, systemic, even intergenerational, to the third and fourth generation. In the Bible, sin and iniquity are societal, systemic, and even intergenerational. I cannot help but hear this passage resonate in my head and in my heart as we in the United States are struggling to deal with the broad, systemic, and deadly racism in our society. The historical, and I would add emotional and economic legacies of slavery and then segregation and the persistent racism continues to impact American society. Psychologists and neuroscientists are starting to understand the impact of intergenerational trauma. Some of that research has studied Holocaust survivors and their children. Other researchers, for example, are exploring the way that epigenetics, chemical changes to the genome after birth, affect how DNA is packaged and expressed without altering its inherited sequence. Apart from modern science, many Native American practitioners have for years expressed how they feel in their bodies, the traumas that have been inflicted upon their ancestors and their lands. Of course, the pervasive and systemic racism that exists in the United States continues to be as deadly as we've seen so recently with the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. But the deadly effects of systemic racism are much more widespread. Elizabeth Brondolo, a psychologist at St. John's University who researches the effects of racism, states, quote, "Studies have shown that long-term discrimination can lead to a disruption in the stress hormone cortisol, leaving people with less biological energy and more fatigue. That kind of chronic, sustained stress contributes to health conditions like diabetes, obesity, and depression. It can also take a significant toll on mental health." End quote. Meghana Keshavan, a biotech journalist, reports that, quote, "The American Academy of Pediatrics last year published a policy statement on how racism is a core cause of health problems in children and adolescents. What wasn't a core cause of health problems? Race itself. The paper drove home a crucial point: racism, not race, affects health, and race shouldn't be used to explain away disparities caused by racism." End quote. As a colleague of mine always reminds people, race is a verb, not a noun. Race is not an attribute, but something people do to others. People are raced. The health problems caused by racism is not because of a person's race. It is because of how other people race them. A black man jogging in a white neighborhood is not a threat because he is black. Rather, a man jogging in a neighborhood is himself threatened and eventually murdered by others because he is raced by them as black. I'm thankful that we are seeing the removal, or at least the recontextualization and rehistoricizing of many Confederate flags, symbols, statues, monuments, and commemorative naming of places. In a non-exhaustive list, the Southern Poverty Law Center reported in 2016 that there were 1,503 Confederate names or symbols in public places in 31 states and the District of Columbia. These include 718 monuments and statues, 109 public schools named for Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, or other Confederate icons. Think about that. Public schools. 80 counties and cities named for Confederates. 10 military bases named for Confederates. Opponents of the removal of Confederate monuments and symbols often argue that this is an erasure of history. But their arguments that these symbols represent their, quote, heritage, not hate, end quote, is the real erasure of history. The erasure of the history of slavery and the horrible suffering that slavery entailed. And what about the history of how these monuments came to be? The Southern Poverty Law Center reports that, quote, two distinct periods saw a significant rise in the dedication of monuments and other symbols. The first began in 1900, amid the period in which states were enacting Jim Crow laws to disenfranchise the newly freed African Americans and resegregate society. The spike lasted well into the 1920s, a period that saw a dramatic resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, which had been born in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. The second spike began in early 1950s and lasted through the 1960s, as the civil rights movement led to backlash among segregationists, end quote. And remember those 109 public schools? Quote, 27 have student populations that are majority African American, and 10 have African American populations of over 90%. At least 39 of these schools were built or dedicated from 1950 to 1970, broadly encompassing the era of the modern civil rights movement. It is this history of when and how these monuments and symbols came to be, the history of trauma and oppression that these symbols have inflicted and continue to inflict, that has been erased. Whose history and heritage and experience matters? Whose lives matter? I'm grateful to see so many Americans and our church stand up and say, Black Lives Matter. I've struggled to think about how I could confront other people, sometimes friends and even relatives, who assert that all lives matter. What can I say to help them understand that it is specifically Black lives that are under threat from police and a racist society? So we need to emphasize that Black lives matter. But racism isn't just something out there, but something that I have to confront even within myself. I have to confront my own racism. I've been horrified by Donald Trump's egregious assault on peaceful demonstrators for a sacrilegious photo opportunity with a Bible in front of a church, and wondered if the statements by the DC Episcopal and Catholic bishops would convince people that there's something wrong in our country. I've been encouraged by former military leaders who have spoken out against Donald Trump's use of our military to attack peaceful protesters, and wondered if that was enough to convince people this administration is out of control. I've watched Buffalo police shove a 75-year-old white protester, sending him to the hospital, and wondered if that was enough to convince people something is wrong with our police system. Or the violent handling of the press by the police in the middle of protests. Is that enough? Or perhaps the beating of a Navy veteran by federal officers in Portland. Or the assault on the women of the Wall of Moms. So many of these other cases, which are in my mind so blatantly wrong and which I think are so convincing, so many of these cases are predicated on the speaking out by or the blatant abuse of white people. My own racist assumption is that these white voices or these examples of abuse of non-black people are somehow more persuasive than the unpublished murders of people of color. But the murder of George Floyd isn't enough. But the murder of Breonna Taylor isn't enough. But the murder of Elijah McClain isn't outrageous enough to be convincing. My bias for those white voices and assaults on white people and thinking they're somehow more persuasive than the murder of black people just demonstrates my own internalized racism. That black lives and voices don't matter. I participate in and contribute to societal, systemic, and even intergenerational racism. I have work to do to internalize in myself Black Lives Matter. Let's face our own racist assumptions, confess them, and actively address their consequences. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. Amen.